James Mitchell had dreamed of this moment since he was 12 years old. Standing at attention outside Buckingham Palace, dressed in the iconic red tunic and tall black bearskin hat, he was finally a Queen's Guard. The morning sun cast long shadows. Across the courtyard, as tourists gathered behind the iron gates, cameras ready to capture the legendary stoic soldiers who never moved, never spoke, never broke character. James had spent months in training, learning the sacred rules that governed. His position, rule number 1, was absolute: maintain complete stillness and silence, regardless of what happened around him. Weather, crowds, or unexpected events meant nothing. A Queen's Guard was a living statue, a symbol of British tradition and discipline. Weight of his rifle felt familiar in his white-gloved hands as he took his position at the palace entrance. His fellow guards stood like marble sculptures at their posts, their faces hidden beneath the shadow of their ceremonial hats. James straightened his shoulders and fixed his gaze forward, preparing for what he expected would be a routine 2-hour shift. The morning started peacefully enough. Tour groups shuffled past, guides explaining the history and significance of the guards. Children pressed their faces against the gates, trying to make the soldiers smile or move. James had seen it all during training exercises. People would wave, shout, even dance in front of the guards, hoping for any reaction. He felt confident in his ability to remain motionless. Around 10 o'clock, something unusual caught his peripheral vision. A large chestnut horse was being led through the palace courtyard by a stable hand. This wasn't entirely uncommon, as the palace maintained horses for ceremonial purposes. What James didn't know was that this particular horse, named Wellington, had quite a reputation among the palace staff. Wellington was known for his intelligence, curiosity, and, most notably, his mischievous nature. The 17-year-old stallion had a history of causing harmless but memorable incidents around the palace grounds. He had once stolen a groundskeeper's lunch, regularly untied his own lead rope, and seemed to take particular pleasure in startling new staff members. As the stable hand led Wellington past the guards, the horse's ears perked up with interest. His dark eyes seemed to study each motionless figure with the calculating gaze of someone planning their next move. Wellington had encountered the guards before, but something about their complete stillness always fascinated him. To a curious and playful animal, these human statues presented an irresistible challenge. The stable hand, busy checking his phone, failed to notice Wellington's growing interest in the guards. The horse's pace slowed as they approached James's position. Wellington's nostrils flared as he caught the scent of the young guard, and his head tilted slightly, as if he was sizing up his target. James could sense the horse's presence growing. Closer, but his training kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. He could hear the soft clip-clop of hooves on the stone courtyard, the gentle snorting of the animal, and the casual footsteps of the handler. Everything seemed normal, routine even. What James couldn't see was the mischievous glint in Wellington's eyes as the horse began to formulate what would become one of the most memorable encounters in recent palace history. The stage was set for a battle of wills between British military discipline and equine creativity, with dozens of tourists unknowingly about to witness something truly extraordinary. Wellington's first move was subtle but deliberate. As the stable hand continued walking, the clever horse managed to slow his pace just enough to create some slack in his lead rope. Years of palace life had taught Wellington exactly how much. Freedom he could gain without alerting his handlers, and he was a master at exploiting these small opportunities. The horse positioned himself directly in front of James, close enough that the guard could feel the animal's warm breath on his face. Wellington stood perfectly still for a moment, as if studying this strange, motionless human. The tourists behind the gates began to notice the unusual scene unfolding, and cameras started clicking more frequently. James felt his heart rate increase slightly, but his training held firm. He had been warned about various distractions during his preparation, though a curious horse standing inches from his face hadn't been specifically covered in the manual. He focused on his breathing, keeping it steady and controlled while maintaining his rigid posture. Wellington, sensing no reaction from the guard, decided to escalate his investigation. The horse slowly extended his massive head toward James's face, his velvet nose coming dangerously close to the guard's chin. The warmth of the animal's breath created a small cloud in the cool morning air, and James could smell the sweet scent of hay and oats. The stable hand, still distracted by his phone, remained completely unaware of his charge's increasingly bold behavior. Wellington, emboldened by the lack of response from both the guard and his handler, decided to test the boundaries further. He gently sniffed along James's collar, his whiskers tickling the young guard's neck. James felt a slight tremor run through his body, but he managed to suppress it. The sensation of the horse's exploration was both surprising and oddly endearing. Wellington's investigation was gentle and curious rather than aggressive, almost like a friendly dog greeting a new person. Still, the unexpected intimacy of the moment was testing James's resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. The crowd behind the gates was growing larger as word spread about the unusual interaction. Tour guides began pointing out the scene to their groups, and several tourists had their phones out, recording what they sensed might become something special. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, though most observers assumed the guard would remain perfectly still regardless of the horse's antics. Wellington, however, was just getting started. Having thoroughly investigated James's scent and found the human's lack of reaction intriguing rather than discouraging, the horse began to circle slowly around the guard's position. His hooves clicked rhythmically on the stone as he moved, creating an almost hypnotic sound that seemed to emphasize the tension of the moment. As Wellington completed his circle, he noticed something that caught his attention even more than the motionless guard. The tall, black bearskin hat perched on James's head seemed to fascinate the horse. Perhaps it reminded him of something from his pasture days, or maybe the unusual texture and size simply triggered his curiosity. Whatever the reason, Wellington's dark eyes fixed on the ceremonial headpiece with obvious interest. The horse positioned himself behind James and stretched his neck forward, bringing his nose close to the base of the bearskin hat. James could feel the animal's presence behind him, could sense the investigation happening just inches from his head, but he remained frozen in position. His palms were beginning to sweat inside his white gloves, and a small bead of perspiration formed on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Wellington's exploration of the hat began with gentle sniffing, his nostrils flaring as he processed the unfamiliar scents of the treated fur and military polish. The horse's breath created small puffs of warm air that James could feel on the back of his neck, sending involuntary shivers down his spine that he struggled to control. The stable hand finally looked up from his phone, but his view of Wellington's activities was blocked by the guard's position. From his angle, it appeared that the horse was simply standing quietly behind the soldier, so he saw no cause for concern. This moment of inattention would prove to be crucial, as it gave Wellington the perfect opportunity to execute the next phase of his mischievous plan. What happened next would become the stuff of palace legend. Wellington, having thoroughly investigated the bearskin hat through scent and gentle touching, decided that a more direct approach was needed. With the precision of a master pickpocket, the horse carefully grasped the edge of James's ceremonial hat between his teeth. The sensation was unmistakable. James felt the slight tug as Wellington began to lift the hat from his head, and for the first time since taking his position, the young guard's composure truly wavered. The bearskin hat was not just a piece of uniform, it was a symbol of centuries of tradition, worth hundreds of pounds, and absolutely irreplaceable during a ceremonial duty. Wellington lifted the hat slowly, almost teasingly, as if he understood the gravity of what he was doing. The morning breeze caught James's now exposed hair, and he could feel the cool air on his head, where the heavy hat had been just moments before. The weight he had grown accustomed to was suddenly gone, replaced by an alarming sense of vulnerability. The crowd behind the gates erupted in gasps and excited chatter as they witnessed something unprecedented. Phones were raised higher, videos began recording, and tour guides found themselves speechless as they watched a horse literally steal a Queen's Guard's hat. The scene was so surreal that many observers initially thought it might be part of some new tourist attraction. James's mind raced through his training. Never break character, never move, never speak. But what about when a horse steals your hat? This specific scenario had definitely not been covered in the manual. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, could hear the excited murmur of the crowd, and worst of all, could sense his fellow guards maintaining their positions while he stood there, hatless and exposed. Wellington, clearly pleased with his successful heist, began to move away from James, while still holding the bearskin hat in his mouth. The horse's steps were deliberate and almost proud, as if he was showing off his prize to the gathered crowd. The hat, designed to stay firmly in place during ceremonial marches and wind, looked almost comically oversized in the horse's mouth. The stable hand, finally alerted by the crowd's reaction, turned around to see his charge parading around with what was obviously a very important piece of military equipment. His face went pale as he realized the magnitude of the situation. A stolen hat might seem minor to most people, but in the context of royal protocol and military ceremony, it was a significant incident. "Wellington!" "No," the stable hand called out, but the horse seemed to interpret this as encouragement rather than a command to stop. Wellington tossed his head playfully, causing the hat to bounce slightly in his grip, which only made the crowd more excited and the stable hand more panicked. James stood frozen in a state of internal crisis. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn around, to pursue the horse, to recover his hat and restore proper order. But his training was absolute. A Queen's Guard does not move, does not break character, does not abandon his post regardless of circumstances. Yet here he was, bareheaded and becoming increasingly desperate as his ceremonial headpiece was being treated like a horse toy. The other guards maintained their positions perfectly, though James was certain he could sense their awareness of the situation. They were probably fighting their own internal battles, caught between the desire to help a fellow guard and the absolute requirement to maintain military discipline. The silence among the guards was deafening in contrast to the growing excitement of the crowd. Wellington continued his victory lap around the courtyard, the bearskin hat still firmly clamped in his jaws. The horse seemed to be enjoying the attention, occasionally stopping to face the crowd as if posing for the numerous photos being taken. His tail swished with what appeared to be genuine pleasure, and his ears were perked forward in a way that suggested he was thoroughly enjoying himself. The stable hand was now in full pursuit, but Wellington had years of experience evading capture when he was in a playful mood. The horse would allow the man to get close, then would casually trot a few steps away, always keeping the hat just out of reach. It was becoming clear that Wellington had no intention of surrendering his prize easily. James felt sweat beginning to form under his red tunic as the situation spiraled further out of his control. The morning that had started so perfectly was turning into what might be remembered as either the most embarrassing or most entertaining moment in recent Queen's Guard history. The only question remaining was how much longer he could maintain his military bearing while a mischievous horse turned his ceremonial duty into an impromptu comedy show. The situation reached a critical point when Wellington decided to add insult to injury. Having successfully stolen the hat and evaded capture for several minutes, the clever horse approached James once again, this time from the front, with the bearskin hat still dangling from his mouth like a trophy. Wellington positioned himself directly in front of the bareheaded guard and began what could only be described as showing off. Wellington stood there, hat in mouth, staring directly at James with what appeared to be a distinctly smug expression. The horse's dark eyes seemed to sparkle with mischief, and his posture suggested he was quite pleased with himself. It was as if he was saying, "Look what I have, and there's nothing you can do about it." James felt his left eye begin to twitch, involuntarily. The combination of stress, embarrassment, and the absurdity of the situation was testing his composure in ways he had never imagined possible. The weight of tradition, the eyes of the crowd, and the presence of his fellow guards all pressed down on him like a physical force, yet he remained rooted to his spot. The crowd had grown substantially by now, with passers-by stopping to see what all the commotion was about. Word was spreading through social media, and more people were arriving specifically to witness the ongoing standoff between the Queen's Guard and the mischievous horse. The scene had all the elements of viral internet content, British tradition, unexpected animal behavior, and genuine human drama. Wellington, sensing that he had a captive audience, decided to escalate his performance. The horse began to shake his head from side to side, causing the bearskin hat to wave like a flag. The sight was both hilarious and horrifying. Hilarious to the delighted crowd, horrifying to James, who could only imagine the damage being done to the carefully maintained ceremonial piece. The stable hand was now running in circles, trying to anticipate Wellington's movements and corner the horse. Other palace staff had begun to arrive, alerted by the growing crowd and the unusual commotion. A groundskeeper appeared with a bucket of oats, hoping to bribe Wellington into surrendering his prize, but the horse was clearly having too much. Fun to be easily bought off. James's internal struggle was reaching a breaking point. His military training demanded absolute stillness, but every human instinct screamed at him to act. The hat represented not just his own dignity, but the respect and tradition of the entire Queen's Guard. Yet moving from his position would be a breach of protocol that could have serious consequences for his career. Wellington, perhaps sensing James's internal turmoil, made his boldest move yet. The horse walked directly up to the guard and gently nudged James's shoulder with his nose, the bearskin hat still hanging from his mouth. It was an almost friendly gesture, as if the horse was inviting the human to join in the game. The touch was soft but unmistakable, and James felt his resolve wavering for the first time. The gentle nudge was so unexpected, so oddly affectionate, that it caught him completely off guard. For a moment, the rigid military bearing that had been drilled into him seemed to crack, and he almost turned his head to look at the horse. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Cameras focused more intently, and the murmur of conversation died down as everyone waited to see if the Queen's Guard would finally break character. The tension was palpable, electric in the morning air. Wellington, as if understanding that he had pushed his human opponent to the edge, decided to try one final, decisive maneuver. The horse stepped back a few paces, lowered his head, and then did something completely unexpected. He began to bow, dipping his massive head toward the ground while still holding the hat, as if he was offering a formal greeting or perhaps even an apology. The gesture was so elegant, so unexpectedly graceful, that it transformed the entire dynamic of the situation. What had been a battle of wills suddenly became something more like a dance, a strange but beautiful interaction between human discipline and animal playfulness. The crowd gasped at the sight, and even some of the other palace staff stopped their rescue efforts to watch. James felt something shift inside him. The horse's bow was so dignified, so strangely respectful, that it seemed to bridge the gap between military protocol and natural behavior. For the first time since the ordeal began, James found himself fighting not just the urge to move, but the urge to smile. Wellington rose from his bow and took a step closer to James, the hat still securely held in his gentle grip. The horse's eyes met the guards, and for a moment there seemed to be an understanding pass between them. Wellington tilted his head slightly as if asking a question, and James felt his carefully maintained composure hanging by the thinnest of threads. What happened next surprised everyone, including James himself. As Wellington stood there with the hat, head tilted in that questioning manner, something remarkable occurred. The horse began to approach James very slowly, step by careful step, as if he finally understood the importance of what he had taken. Wellington's demeanor had completely changed. Gone was the playful, mischievous energy that had driven his hat-stealing adventure. Instead, the horse moved with an almost ceremonial dignity, his head held high and his steps measured and deliberate. It was as if he had suddenly realized he was part of something much larger than a simple game. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Wellington approached the motionless guard. The horse stopped directly in front of James, so close that their faces were only inches apart. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the trained soldier and the intelligent animal, locked in a gaze that seemed to communicate more than words ever could. Then, in a gesture that would be talked about for years to come, Wellington, slowly, carefully, began to lift his head upward. The bearskin hat, still gently held in his mouth, rose toward James's bare head. The horse's movements were precise and controlled, as if he understood exactly what needed to happen. James felt his heart pounding as the hat came closer to his head. This was the moment of truth. Wellington was actually trying to return the hat, to put it back where it belonged. The young guard had to make a choice: maintain his rigid position and risk the hat falling, or make the slyest adjustment to help the horse complete this extraordinary act of redemption. Wellington stretched, his neck upward, trying to position the hat correctly, but the angle was difficult. The horse's breathing was steady and focused, and James could see the concentration in the animal's dark eyes. Wellington was genuinely trying to fix what he had done, but he needed just a tiny bit of cooperation from the human. The crowd was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something truly special. Even the palace staff had stopped their rescue efforts, realizing that Wellington was handling the situation in his own remarkable way. Cameras continued to record, but the clicking and chattering had ceased entirely. James made the smallest possible movement, barely perceptible to most observers, but significant enough to help Wellington position the hat correctly. The guard lowered his head by perhaps an inch, just enough to meet the horse's effort halfway. It was a breach of protocol so minor that it could hardly be called breaking character. Yet it was also an act of cooperation that transformed the entire incident. Wellington, sensing the subtle assistance, carefully maneuvered the bearskin hat onto James's head. The horse's teeth never touched the guard's skin, and his movements were so gentle that the hat settled into place as softly as if it had been placed there by a fellow soldier. The precision and care with which Wellington completed this task was nothing short of remarkable. As soon as the hat was secure, Wellington stepped back and did something that left everyone speechless. The horse reared up slightly on his hind legs, not in aggression or excitement, but in what appeared to be a formal salute. His front hooves left the ground for just a moment, and he held the position with perfect balance before settling back down. The gesture was so unexpected, so dignified, and so seemingly intentional that the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. People were laughing, crying, and cheering all at once, overwhelmed by what they had just witnessed. The sound echoed off the palace walls, creating a moment of pure joy that seemed to celebrate both the tradition of the Queen's Guard and the intelligence of one remarkable horse. James felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, though whether from relief, gratitude, or simple emotional overwhelm, he couldn't say. The hat was back where it belonged, his dignity was restored, and somehow, through it all, he had managed to maintain his post. More importantly, he had been part of something magical, a connection between human and animal that transcended rules and protocols. Wellington, his mission apparently complete, allowed the stable hand to finally approach and take hold of his lead rope. The horse's ears were perked forward with what looked like satisfaction, and his tail swished gently as if he was pleased with how everything had turned out. He had caused chaos, yes, but he had also resolved it in the most beautiful way possible. Thigh, stable hand, still somewhat stunned by what he had witnessed, led Wellington away from the guards area. As they walked across the courtyard, the horse turned his head back once to look at James, and the guard could have sworn he saw a wink in that intelligent dark eye. The remainder of James's shift passed in a blur of continued attention and whispered conversations among the growing crowd. Word of the incident had spread beyond the immediate area, and tourists were arriving specifically hoping to catch a glimpse of both the guard and the famous horse. James maintained his position with renewed confidence, though he couldn't help but feel that something fundamental had changed within him. When his replacement arrived at the end of his 2-hour shift, James finally allowed himself to relax. As he marched away from his post in the traditional ceremonial manner, he could hear the crowd still talking excitedly about what they had witnessed. Several tourists approached him as he moved toward the palace, asking for photos and expressing their amazement at what had happened. Later that afternoon, James was called into his commanding officer's office. He approached with some trepidation, unsure whether he would be commended or reprimanded for his role in the morning's events. The Azure officer, a stern man with decades of military experience, looked up from his desk with an expression that was difficult to read. "Mitchell," the officer began, "I've been hearing some rather extraordinary reports about your shift this morning." James stood at attention, preparing for whatever consequences might follow. "It seems," the officer continued, "that you managed to maintain your post and your composure under circumstances that were completely unprecedented in the history of the Queen's Guard." The officer went on to explain that video footage of the incident had already begun circulating online, and the palace's public relations department was fielding calls from news organizations around the world. Rather than being seen as a breach of protocol, James's handling of the situation was being praised as a perfect example of grace under pressure. "The slight adjustment you made to help the horse return your hat," the officer said, "showed exactly the kind of judgment and humanity that we value in our guards. You found a way to honor both your duty and the unique circumstances you faced. Well done." James felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed quickly by a sense of pride that was deeper than anything he had experienced in his military career. He had faced an impossible situation and had somehow found a way to navigate it with both his dignity and his principles intact. Over the following days, the story of James and Wellington spread across social media and news outlets worldwide. The video of Wellington returning the hat and performing his impromptu salute became one of the most watched clips of the year, bringing joy to millions of people around the globe. The incident was hailed as a beautiful example of the connection between humans and animals, and as a demonstration of the grace and adaptability of British military tradition. Wellington, meanwhile, became something of a celebrity himself. The palace decided to embrace the positive attention, and Wellington was given his own social media accounts where his daily activities were shared with his growing fan base. He continued to live at the palace, though his interactions with the guards were now more carefully supervised. Not that Wellington seemed interested in repeating his hat-stealing performance. James went on to complete his service as a Queen's Guard with distinction, and the incident with Wellington became a treasured story that he would tell for the rest of his life. He often reflected on how a moment that could have been a disaster had instead become something beautiful, all because of the intelligence and ultimate kindness of one remarkable horse. Years later, when James had moved on to other roles within the military, he would occasionally return to visit Buckingham Palace. Without fail, he would make time to visit Wellington in the royal stables. The horse always seemed to remember him, greeting him with gentle nudges and what James swore were knowing looks. The incident had taught James valuable lessons about flexibility, grace under pressure, and the importance of recognizing that sometimes the most memorable moments in life come from the most unexpected sources. Wellington had challenged everything James thought he knew about military discipline, and in doing so had shown him that true strength sometimes means knowing when to bend without breaking. The story of the Queen's Guard and the mischievous horse became part of palace folklore, a tale that was shared with new guards as both entertainment and instruction. It served as a reminder that while tradition and protocol are important, there is also value in adaptability, compassion, and the recognition that even the most solemn duties can be touched by moments of unexpected magic. In the end, neither James nor Wellington had truly broken character that day. Instead, they had both revealed something deeper about their true characters: the guard's capacity for grace under impossible pressure, and the horse's underlying intelligence and sense of justice. Together, they had created a moment that celebrated both military tradition and the timeless bond between humans and animals, leaving everyone who witnessed it with a story they would never forget.